Is another weekly installment of our live Ask an Investigator webinars. We're going to start here in a couple minutes. We have some questions from some users over the last couple of days, and feel free to email our help desk, help@activeintel.com, and a licensed investigator will forward the question along, and we'll put it here on the channel. Most of the questions we're going to start out with today have to do with legal investigations versus illegal investigations, what makes an investigation legal and what a private investigator can do that is appropriate under the law, and what things an investigator can't do. That way you'll know if you're engaging with an investigator, what capabilities they have and which things are not possible. And it's important to know as a client what your investigator is doing, whether you're an attorney or if you're a consumer, because if your investigator is using techniques that are not allowed under the law, the results of those may not be able to be used in a legal process in court, and may even get you into trouble. So we're going to jump right in and talk about one of the primary statutes that govern what an investigator can do. It's called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLB compliance. And the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was a law that came out in the 90s and has been updated since then to encompass mostly what's called pretexting, meaning that an investigator or really any party can't pretend to be somebody else, and they can't misrepresent themselves in order to get certain protected information. The law was originally formed because of an event that happened with a large company. I believe it was some tech company. It might have been Hewlett Packard. You can check me on that. Where a board of directors were having meetings about the future of the company and strategic planning, and some of that information was getting into the press. So the one of the board members, it might have been the chairman of the board, chairperson, engaged with a private investigator. And the investigator hacked into the phone records, the cell phone records of all of the other attendees of these meetings. And they found that one of the attendees was making regular calls to the media, to a newspaper reporter. And that person was found out to be the leak of these meetings. And in reality, the person was actually doing something wrong. They weren't supposed to be releasing this information to the public. However, the method by which it was discovered what was happening was also found to be illegal. And there were some consequences for the party that did this investigation, for the board member, and there was actually legal consequences. And it motivated the law to be passed, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, named after the three promoters of this law in Congress. And this governs most of the research that is done by an investigator. So basically it means you can't go into a bank and pretend you're somebody to get somebody's bank account information. You can't call up the phone company and pretend you're somebody else to get phone records. That was, for a very long time in the 70s and 80s, a go-to method for investigators to get things. Pretend you're somebody else to get records. Misrepresent who you are. Sometimes it was called social engineering. You call up the utility company to say, hey, look, I'm Joe Schmo. Send me my last 2 months' utility bills. And you weren't actually Joe Schmo. Maybe you had their information. Maybe you had their social security number. Maybe you had some of the login information for their account. In some states, it was a gray area. Some states, it was illegal. This national law made it completely illegal nationwide to do. So this pretexting statute governs a lot of what investigators do. And you want to make sure that any techniques that are being used for an investigation on your behalf aren't using illegal pretexting. Another example of an illegal pretext, something we saw in a case pretty recently, was where we had a client who we were working with, representing, who was involved with a lawsuit against another party. and the other party was trying to get asset information, basically bank account information, for our client. And the way that they went about doing it was they sent a check to our client that pretended to be a refund check, a rebate check. They said, "Hey, thanks for shopping, supporting, U.S. companies, buying American," whatever it was, had a little U.S. flag in the check, and it said, "Here's your, rebate check for $4.82 or whatever it was, to appreciate your business." And presumably, the person who received the check would deposit it in their bank, and then when it came back from the bank to whoever wrote the check, it would show your banking information on the back, your account, what bank it was. And this company, we did some research, was just a mailing address in California, and it traced back to some dead end. And we did a little more research, and we found that there was a common address to a private investigator who was located in the area where our client was, which was not California, not where this check came from. And fortunately, our client had been counseled by us during this case to be aware of certain things. Look out for any suspicious activity, any phone calls, visitors, mail, people driving by your house, what to look for when you're in a case to make sure that you're not being, it's called counterintelligence, to make sure no one's doing anything improper. So we played it out. The way that we recommended that client deal with it was to open up a new bank account, put $100 in the new bank account, then deposit this check into the account, and we'll follow it from there. And sure enough, the check cleared. It went back, and once we had the evidence from that, we gave it to our client and their attorney, and they were able to use it in court to show that the other side was doing something that may be improper. And that a lot of times, not in every case, but a lot of times makes the court give more latitude to the party that's been harmed by this. So our client was allowed to get more discovery, maybe legal fees, that kind of thing. So make sure that any methods that are being used on your behalf, or if you're hiring an investigator, ask them, is it GLB compliant, Gramm-Leach-Bliley compliant, and they're following other laws too. So that's one of the most common types of improper, illegal investigations. Another area that comes up a lot with illegal investigations is in the area of monitoring location. A lot of investigators, instead of going through the motions of doing surveillance and following people, they'll just try to slap a GPS device on somebody's car, which in most cases is extremely illegal. Pull something up here to see if we got any emails for possible questions. Let's take a look. Yeah, we got a couple here. So if you have any subjects for this video, make sure you email them to help@activeintel.com. But that's another area, is when an investigator will use GPS rather than surveillance to find a location for a subject. In most cases, it's illegal, and you don't want to be doing it. Make sure this mic is going good. So we'll get back to illegal investigations momentarily. One of the other subjects that has been asked about is hacking. Can an investigator hack a computer? And the answer is, in most cases, no. Hacking, the typical definition is improperly accessing an account or a computer by surreptitious means, meaning you get somebody's password, or you guess a password, or use a password that doesn't belong to you, or use some other method that's not allowable. In most cases, that's not allowed. Hacking by the strict definition, is almost always illegal, even without an investigation. But if you use it for an investigation, it may add other details. And I know a lot of times the thought process is, if you are wanting to get data from a computer, if you hire a hacker, they can get it from the computer. The problem is, every access to a computer, even if it's done through hacking, will create a record of that event. It will create a record of when that activity happened. Even if the person tries to cover their tracks, it will show that it happened. And once that's discovered, a good counter investigation will try to find where that source came from. So hacking is usually a no-no. You want to make sure, if you're doing it, you're using proper discovery. Here comes another message here. I'll wait for that to finish. Other discovery methods which may be legal to get information. One good thing about computers is information stays forever. Even things like voicemails that you delete. Let's suppose you have a phone like right behind me, somebody calls up, leave a voicemail, and you delete that voicemail. Well, that actual audio message is data. It's stored on a computer in the same way that a Word document is stored, or a PDF file, or any other file is stored. So it's a file on a computer. It's not voice in the air somewhere. It's stored on a computer. Even if it's in the cloud, it's on a computer. And in most cases, when you hit delete, or if you say delete, or if you push 2 on your phone to delete, it actually doesn't delete the file. What it does is eliminate the connection in the directory to that file. And because of that, later on, that can be recovered by using proper discovery methods. So you won't be able to get it by hacking, or maybe you could, but it'll be illegal and discovered. But in many cases, you can recover that document. So that's a really good question about hacking. Let's see what else has popped up. I have a question here. It looks like Bo G is asking something about Commonwealth countries in the UK. A little more information on that. If you could type in some more details about that, we can maybe answer that for you. Commonwealth law and investigations in countries that use that is actually a good thing. A lot of times clients will ask us about, well, if it's overseas, can you do an investigation if it's offshore, thinking that's a bad thing. Well, the good news about offshore is many of the privacy laws that exist in the US are not quite as strong offshore. So keep that in mind. If you have something that is offshore, even has a connection to offshore, sometimes the investigations are actually easier. Pretty good example. Okay, this has to do with, okay, I think I can come up with something on that. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent about these Commonwealth laws. So there are laws in the US where if you want to get documents, or you want to do a search and seizure, you have to go through the public sector. Law enforcement does a search warrant. In many Commonwealth countries, you can actually do a civil search warrant. And those can be done through the court without involving law enforcement. One way of doing it is called a Norwich Pharmacol order, which is a method where you can get an order from the court to have private investigators actually break and enter a property to get documents if it can be shown that there's a risk that they are in danger of being damaged, lost, destroyed. You can't do that in the U.S. Right? You have to have law enforcement do a search warrant. So the question had to do with the Commonwealth countries in the U.S. Are there differences? Yeah, there's differences. The differences are there may be other types of methods available. If you have a case that is in the U.S. that may need some offshore involvement, you can do, and again, this is legal advice. You don't want to get legal advice from an investigator. You want to get it from an attorney. So use this as a guide. Don't rely on it for legal decisions. If you have to make a legal decision, get it from a qualified attorney. But we can tell you a little bit about what we've seen before, with the understanding that this is not giving you legal advice. This is giving you suggestions on what to do when you're getting legal advice. So to make that clear, this is not legal advice. This is description of legal processes that you can get more information from a qualified attorney. But the way that normally an attorney would go about getting overseas information, if their case is in the U.S., is by use of what's called letters rogatory. Letters rogatory is where a judge in the U.S. will engage conversation or communications with a proper legal authority in another country using letters rogatory to domicile the case in another country so that an investigator, an attorney, or a court can take action in that other country. So that's something that has to do with Commonwealth countries. Let me just do a search on what this person is asking about here. See if we can come up with some info for you. Yeah, this question had to do with vote rigging using a method called hammer and scorecard that was used in the UK and that may have had to do something in the US. We're not familiar specifically with that process, although we have seen where there have been successful hacking attempts on all kind of devices. We were members of an organization that had an event, a conference, a seminar back a couple years ago, where they had a demonstration that a hacker brought 5 or 6 different devices to this event to show how they could be hacked. And one of them was a machine that tabulated elections. Now, this happened to do with a different type of election. It wasn't in the public sector. It was in the private sector. It was basically voting on monetary results. And they were able to get into every device that was there, phone devices, election devices, computers. One of the devices actually was a secured video monitoring system. It was a company who had cameras in their manufacturing plant for safety, to make sure that people are doing the right procedures and that the machines are operating and the conveyor belts were going the right way. And this system was thought to have vulnerability. So as part of the analysis of it, the hacking company asked if it would be okay to bring this in to this event to show how it could be hacked. So what they did was they brought the main computer for this monitoring system and 2 cameras, brought it into this event, plugged them in, turned them on. They didn't do anything to it. In fact, the company, the manufacturing company, had control over these devices the whole time before they got to this seminar. And the reason they did it was because they were concerned that other people outside the company were able to monitor their cameras. So they brought it in and set it up, put the video on the big screen in front of the seminar. They sat down with their laptop and they did a couple things, and they were able to monitor the cameras not through the device, through an outside connection through the internet, because this main brain of this camera system had to connect to the internet occasionally to do updates and to provide information. Even though it was hardwired to a monitoring system, it still had to use the internet. And because of that, this hacker was able to go in and monitor it. And what was determined later is that a competitor, another manufacturing company, had hacked into their system and was watching their assembly line for 3 reasons. First of all, to see what their volume was, what kind of business were they doing, and they could count how many of these objects were being manufactured. It was a metal device that they were manufacturing, and they could see how many were going through the assembly line in a certain period of time, so they knew what their competitor was doing. They also used it to determine different techniques that the competitor was doing to be able to be more efficient, to save money on their manufacturing. And the reason that this started was because there was a vendor who sold products to both companies. And this vendor was more of a colleague to the competitor. So told him, this is what kind of cameras I see. This is the system. I don't know if they took some pictures and told the competitor. The competitor was able to use that to get a hacker to do that. So really, any device can be hacked. There's even air-gapped devices that have been known to be hacked. There was an article that came out a few months ago. Let's see if I can pull it up, about how to hack to be able to listen in on, and I'll get back to this hammer and scorecard vote rigging here in a second. To use a light bulb to listen in on conversations in a room. Yeah. So this article came out in June, where researchers were able to use a light bulb to work out what's being said in a room. Basically, what it works is, as I'm speaking right now, the sound waves are going to the microphone, to different places. It's also going to the light bulb in the overhead light in the room, or any light bulbs in the room. And there was a kit that this research company made that basically monitored the vibration of that light bulb and turned it into a microphone, because the light bulb is vibrating just like the inside of this microphone is, and they were able to monitor that through radio waves and lasers to have it feed back the sound coming from that room, and they could use it. One of the ways that a lot of spies try to avoid, and CIA and other agencies, what's called a laser mic, where you can shine a laser at a window pane on a room and get the same vibration on the window pane. But what a lot of high security rooms have is they have 2 window panes that are set apart, not just a double, triple pane window, but they're set apart so there's no vibration connection between them. Well, this is a way to defeat that air gap by doing laser beam. So yeah, so for the person asking about the hammer scorecard, not really sure if it was used in that country. It looks like the question is, was that used in a certain country? We wouldn't know if that vote rigging was done in a certain country or not. That wouldn't be something we would know about. The question had to do with how widespread was a particular fraud being used, and ask about a certain country in Europe, and we wouldn't know if that type of election fraud was used in that country. So let's see what else is on the list. Yeah, so here's another question about investigations. if you are doing certain types of investigations, you want to make sure that the person doing it is actually licensed. There's a lot of offerings online that have to do with, yeah, we're glad to help as best we could. It looks like there may have been, to change subjects real quick, to the person who asked about that vote rigging. It looks like there are references to that type of process being used in some of those countries, but it may be a variation of it, not the direct variation. That's just something we did a little search for online, so you may want to look that up. But anyways, back to the licensing. There's a lot of unlicensed providers of services that technically you need to have a license for, right? So if you're doing certain type of asset searches or certain types of surveillance, you have to have a license to do that, a certain type of investigator license. And you want to make sure that the person or company that's doing your investigation is actually licensed to do it. Some companies don't even know they have to be licensed. Some companies do, and they are just trying to do the business without being licensed. In fact, if you notice on our videos, normally most videos don't have comments set up. And the reason why is because these videos are so often used by clients that have questions about investigations, that there are hackers and third parties that will put comments on the videos that says, hey, look, if you want a hacker, here's our email address, and put a comment on one of our videos or even other investigative agencies' videos. And it's so widespread that almost every video that has comments will have a message from somebody trying to do marketing through somebody else's video. So that's one of the reasons why. And those are all unlicensed for the most part. So make sure that if you're engaging with somebody to do an investigation, that you ask them, number one, how they're doing it to make sure it's legal, and number two, are they licensed? So that's good. Let's see what else we have for a question. This is a very common question. It may have been answered in previous live videos. Is, can an investigator force a person to answer questions? And the answer is no. A lot of what we do in investigations is witness interviews, where if you have somebody who works in a company where there may be fraud or maybe some type of activity that needs to be discovered, can you sit down and interrogate a potential witness or even a potential violator? And the answer is no. You can do an interview, but the important thing about a private investigator is you got to make sure that you recognize it's not law enforcement, and that's a positive and a negative. Number one, you can't arrest somebody and force them to sit into a witness interview or into a interrogation. However, because you're not law enforcement, you also don't have to do things like read somebody their rights or do things in a certain way. There are pros and cons. And from a private investigator standpoint, it's actually a good thing because it forces the investigator to make sure it's a two-way conversation, that you are engaging with the person to show what's in their best interest, not lying to them, not misrepresenting things, but giving them a true and complete description of what the investigation is about and why their answers can help them and help their company or their employer. So that's a good question. Can you force somebody? An investigator can't arrest somebody or detain them or lock them in a room to ask them questions. But they also, because they're not law enforcement, usually they have a more open conversation with that person. If somebody's sitting down in front of a uniformed police officer, they may be more concerned or skeptical about what to do. They might need an attorney, right? Whether it's a private investigator, you don't have to tell them that they need an attorney, because they don't necessarily need one. They don't have the right to an attorney. They can leave anytime they want. It's all voluntary. And a good investigator will discuss with that person why that voluntary conversation is good for them. It's a good thing. Let's see what else is on the list here. That's not a good question. All right, here's one that comes up quite a bit with online scams. How can you tell if an online investment is a scam? It's similar to something we talked about a couple weeks ago. On the surface, it may not seem like a scam, but if you're at all skeptical, or even if you're not, the first thing to do before you send anybody any money is ask them, what is the documentation of where their money is held? So if you're sending money to somebody who's investing in stocks or real estate or any kind of security or Bitcoin, you want to make sure that they're able to represent where their funds are held and that there's a third party that can verify it. You don't want to go just on the statement provided by the company you're sending it to. So if you send money to XYZ company to put in real estate, are they able to provide you with the deed information or the title information about the real estate you supposedly own? If you're sending money for, let's say, a securities or stocks, can they show the account where your stocks are held? And can it be verified by a third party, not just their representation? That's the first thing about a scam. The other thing about a scam is, are the returns either improbable or unrealistic, meaning that if a company is offering to pay you 15 or 20% a month on some investment, well, if it's that good of an investment, why don't they have the money to put into it, right? Why don't they want to make the 15%? If the investment is so good that they would pay 15 or 20% a month, why don't they just put their own money into it? It means one of two things. Either the investment isn't that good, so they don't want to put their own money into it, or they don't have any money. Well, how could they not have any money if the investment's that good, right? If the investment is 15 or 20%, they would have to have lots of money because they have made that kind of return. So if something is really that high, you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't the person who's asking for money want to put their own money into it and need yours? It's either that there's not that much return or they don't have any money to put in. Either one is not a good sign. The other thing is, any legitimate company or investment, they can borrow money pretty cheap. Right now, the interest rates on any kind of business loan, SBA loan, mortgage, commercial property, are a single digit percentage per year, 2, 3, 4% per year. Even high risk commercial paper, most banks are lending at 5 or 6%. So if the person is going to pay you more than 5 or 6%, it means that that investment somehow is not qualified for a bank. And if the bank is not going to give them money because they see something wrong with it, why would you, right? I mean, the bank knows what they're doing. That's why they have the money. And if a bank is not going to give this person funds for their investment or their, for their opportunity, then why would you do it? If the bank's passing on the deal, you should pass on the deal too, because a bank can afford to lose money, right? And they lose money all the time. But they make it up for the ones that are winners. But they very carefully scrutinize investments for underwriting or lending. And if the rate is that much higher than what a bank would be, there's got to be something to it, especially if the offering for the investment is done through an affinity, meaning that if it's done through a social group or your church or some group where they're passing around this information or getting referrals that way, that's another red flag that you want to check out. Let's take a look at the questions. Again, you can email questions to help@activeintel.com. Take a look through and see what would be something that would be of interest. Talked about that last week. This is not necessarily that important for clients, but a common question, and there's a couple people that asked, how do you get licensed as an investigator? How do you become an investigator? Well, almost every state that does licensing for investigative agencies, the requirement is that you have to have a certain number of years experience as an investigator to become a licensed investigator. Well, it sounds like catch 22, and it kind of is. Most of the way that an individual becomes a licensed private investigator is because of law enforcement. If you were in the police department, or if you were a detective, or even some military investigators, the activities that you did qualified for the certain amount of time. Like some states require 2 years experience, or 4 years experience, or 5 years experience as an investigator to get a license. And most people get it in law enforcement. Many private investigators, they were in law enforcement. They were a police officer. They worked in the police department for 20 years. And many public sector jobs like police, fire, teachers, you can retire after 20 or 25 years and get very good retirement and benefits. So if you start as a police officer at age 25, you work there for 20 or 25 years, you're 45 or 50, you retire, you're getting good benefits, but now you don't have anything to do. So you become a private investigator. Now, not every police job gives you the experience to become a private investigator. If you're just a beat cop or traffic, you may not have the activities to document to show that you can get an investigator license. Now, it has to be certain types of activities. That's the most common. You can also be an internal investigator. Let's say you're insurance fraud investigator for Geico Insurance, or you are an internal security officer for IBM Computers or some Fortune 500 company. If you document the activities that you did for that company and they were appropriate, you can use that to get a private investigator license. So that's how most people get into becoming an investigator. Now, just because you're a licensed investigator doesn't necessarily mean that you're magically an investigative agency. There's more to it than that. You have to have corporation and insurance, and then the other part is developing business. You have to make sure that you're in a certain field of business. One thing about private investigating is the list of activities you're allowed to do is very, very long. You can do surveillance and asset searches and witness interviews and different types of research. If you're an investigative agency, you probably don't want to represent that you do all of them, because you're not going to do all of them very good. Just like when you look at a law firm or an attorney, most attorneys specialize in what's called a practice area. They're a divorce attorney, a litigation attorney, a real estate attorney. And an investigative agency should really specialize in 1 or 2, maybe 3 areas so that you're good at that. You don't want to represent you do everything, unless you have a large agency with 15 or 20 or 30 more people. Because if you specialize in a certain area, you'll be good at those things. And if you're a client looking at an investigative agency, that's something to look at. Do they specialize in the area of investigation that you particularly need in your case? So that's a good question about licensing for investigators. Let's see what else is on the list. That question is not really about investigations. This one is about Ponzi schemes. Yeah, we'll talk about Ponzi schemes a little bit. It brings up a good point. There was a funny story. We're going to do another video about this specifically, about a Ponzi schemer who had been stealing money from people for a while, and I think there was a warrant out for their arrest, or he was aware that the authorities were after him. And so he was fleeing from the police, and his method of trying to get away, this was in the news just the other day, was he had scuba diving equipment, one of those little electric underwater scooters, and he pulled his car over on the side of the road and jumped in a lake with his scooter and was trying to stay underwater and zoom away from the cops that were chasing him. And it was kind of a funny story because he got caught, and the reason why is because the police were able to see the bubbles on the surface where he was. Plus, he jumped into a lake. I believe it was in Northern California, might have been Lake Tahoe, that the water was freezing cold, 40, 50 degrees. So he really couldn't stay underwater that long. So his idea of doing a scooter to get away from the police, underwater scooter, might have seemed like a good idea, but it wasn't very well thought out because he got caught. Let's see if I can find that article. Yeah, it was in California. Near Redding, California, Lake Shasta. Yeah, Shasta. I've been to that lake, and it's way, way north. And this time of year, I can only imagine how cold it is. So, yeah, the backstory is a grand jury indicted him and his partner, allegedly, for fraud. And we'll talk about Ponzi schemes. This is a good example. From the story, it says that in 2015 until this year, so 5 years, this person collected $35 million from investors that he called Wealth Legacy and a couple other names. And he made up a word called the Upvesting Fund that was an algorithmic trading fund with a history of success. So that's another red flag. If the investment fund can't describe exactly how they're making money, or they claim that it's some kind of a secret, that's a good way to try to obscure the fact that there is no real investment. Now, let me back up. That's not to say that if you put money into a real estate investment and the person says, well, we don't know if the price is going to go up or down, that's different. All right. The way that in theory it would make money is if the value went up or the rents went up. But if somebody says, well, it's a secret algorithm or it's a complicated program we can't tell you about, that's a red flag. Good example is, remember the Bernie Madoff case back from the mid 2000s, late 2000s. That was the largest Ponzi scheme ever perpetrated. And it was represented that he had some kind of inside knowledge how to trade stocks. And I believe even that was called an algorithmic trading fund. More about this article of the person who jumped into the icy lake says right here, the person, and named them by name, says he attended Bethel Church and used his connections at the prominent Redding megachurch to prey on fellow parishioners. This is a perfect example. This is a very common element of Ponzi schemes. It's used affinity marketing or relationship marketing within a church, within a community, within a some kind of club or group, because it's not just marketing. It's not just a way to get in touch with people. It's a way to get credibility. If your church member tells you Joe Schmo has a good investment, it's already implying some credibility, right? So it's almost like Joe Schmo is vouching for, or the parishioner is vouching for Joe Schmo. So this is a very common element. The scammer allegedly admitted that there was no actual upvesting fund, that he was just taking the money and paying off new investors' returns with it. Here's the numbers, right? Collected $35 million in investments, paid back $8 million to investors. Use investor money for business and personal expenses, houseboat, very few, if any, liquid assets remain to pay investors. Here's the important thing. Even if the scammer, the Ponzi schemer, has taken money and spent it all, presumably, there's many, many examples of methods to recover funds as a victim, even if the bank accounts are empty from the scammer. There's a lot of and we've covered this in other videos, we've covered this in other conversations, but in this case, the scammer took in $3.5 million, paid back $8 million, and has no money left over. But there are other ways to get the money back. Good example is the Scott Rothstein case in South Florida. They call it the mini Madoff case. It was $1 billion case, and he spent all the money, didn't have anything left. Those investors got back 100% of their money, even after the fees of legal fees and trustees and investigations. They got back 100%. It comes from third-party liability, and that's a whole nother subject. Looks like this scam was out of, well, he looked like he had offices in Northern California, San Diego, Colorado, and Illinois. Looks like they were doing, what they represented was cryptocurrency, which is one of the most common. When we talk to clients who have lost money, the most common thing we hear, we even ask them ahead of time, say, hey, I lost money in a Ponzi. And we'll ask them, was it crypto? Was it Bitcoin? And they say, yeah, it was. Because that's what a lot of scammers represent, because there's no way to verify it. Yeah, it looks like this church had a prior case where somebody else was stealing money from parishioners. So it's another common element. We've even found where when there are victims of a scam that have lost money, the company will go out of business and close down. And what they'll do is they will sell their list of the victims to another scammer, or one of the members of that company will start a new scam, because it's already been proven that those people are vulnerable to sending money to a scam. So that's a very common thing to happen, is a second scam from the same source. So we'll do one more question. We'll finish up. We're coming up on close to an hour. It's about 45 minutes. We'll see what else we have for a question that would be of interest. Pick out a good one. Talked about that already. Ponzi schemes. How can you tell the owner of a website? Okay, so here's something that's relatively simple, and this is something that you can do yourself as a consumer. If you want to know who's really behind a website, there's a few steps to take. The first step is to do what's called a whois lookup. And a whois lookup is exactly that. There's a couple websites that you can do a Google search for whois, and you can put in the name of a website, xyz.com, and it'll tell you who the registered owner of that website is. Now, some websites have privacy on the registration information. If that's the case, on that whois results, it'll tell you who is the name of the company that did the registration, not the owner, but who did the registration. And you can go directly to that website and sometimes get the owner's name. If that fails, the next step is to look at the page source of that website, not what's on the screen, but there's code of that website. And the way you do that is in your browser, there's a menu that will show you the page source or the page code, and it will show up on your screen as text. It looks like a Word document, but it's all computer code. And if you look through that computer code, in many cases, there are references to the actual developer of that site, the programmer of that site, the address or name, because a lot of times that code is carried over from other sites. So look through that code for the page source. The next thing you're going to do to verify that, or if you need to go further, is to look at an older version of the website. Things like Wayback Machine or Internet Archive. You can pull back a version of the website from 10 years ago or 5 years ago and do the same thing. See if there's an address or a phone number there. See if there's an email there, and search that way. Fourth level is to communicate with that website. Send them an email. Put a message into their form. And you may find that when you get a response back, you can look through the email header of your response to see what IP address it comes from. What phone number do they give? And you can backtrace the phone number. If there's a mailing address, you can backtrace the mailing address. So there's a number of layers to finding out the owner of a website that aren't just as simple as looking at the address on the bottom of the screen. Regardless of that, if there is a physical address on the website, which there usually is, do a maps search on that address. A lot of times you'll find that it's a post office. We found where somebody was pretty clever that instead of putting P.O. Box 112, they put the address of the post office and put apartment 112. Because if you mail something there to that address with a unit or apartment number, it'll get into your mailbox. So it made it look like it wasn't a P.O. box. Pretty clever. And there's ways of finding out the owner of a mailbox too. There's some forms you can fill out from the post office that will give you the owner's name on a mailbox. So start with the who is, go to Internet Archive, look at the page code, and then communicate with that person. Even if it's really important, and we do this all the time with investigations, we may spend a week or a month doing different communications with that person to see what responses we get. Here's another example. Let's say you want to find out who the owner of a website is that's being very cagey or very suspicious about who is trying to track them down. We will create a new email address for one of our investigators. It won't be anything fake. It'll be, Sally Smith, actual name at Yahoo or at Google or at Gmail. And it'll be a brand new email address. And we'll use that with communications. And what we'll find many times is we'll get an official response back from that person at the suspicious website. And they'll respond to that email. And then we'll wait a week or two. And all of a sudden, we'll start getting advertisements or other messages or spam to that email. Well, we know that the only place that email was used was with this suspicious website. Now, if we find these other emails come in, we know it's related. And then when we look at those websites or those emails, and that will track down what the source is. Many times, if you wait long enough, a week or two or three, you'll get 4 or 5 spams or other messages, and you can connect the dots on those. You can connect the IP addresses, you can connect phone numbers, you can connect contact information and find out that it all triangulates back to the same place: physical location, geographic location, or address. And sometimes you can even look up DBAs and companies to find out officers of corporations that are behind that message. So we got another question. This is a really good question too. I'm going to jump ahead because this one is related to something we talked about before. Question is, do you have to identify yourself as an investigator under the law? That's a good question. In most cases, it's not necessary to identify yourself as a private investigator. In most cases, you can't misrepresent yourself. You can't say you're law enforcement, right? You can't say that you represent their attorney. For example, if we contact a party who's represented by an attorney, we can't say we're calling you on behalf of your attorney, right? Or we can't say we're calling you on behalf of your bank. You don't necessarily, in most cases, and the laws may vary a little bit from state to state, but under the federal statute, you don't necessarily have to say, I'm a private investigator. We always recommend that it's a good idea to, if possible, especially if you're asking for information that is sensitive, because again, it goes back to GLB. If you're misrepresenting to get certain information, it's not good. Here's a perfect example. We had a case a while back where there was a subject that we wanted to get information about. And this subject visited a restaurant. And we were doing surveillance on this subject, and we're taking pictures of them in the restaurant. It had to do with a case involving use of company time and use of actually even government resources, because it was a government contractor, without getting into too much detail. And so we were documenting that while they were representing to their employer and to the government, that they were working on a government project, they were actually in a restaurant. In fact, they were at Hooters, right? And so we had surveillance and we showed that they were doing this certain thing. But to add icing on the cake, we wanted to get a copy of the receipt for that visit. So the surveillance person was there monitoring. We had a couple other people in the wings, and the surveillance person, when they left, made sure that somebody else could pick up the surveillance outside the restaurant. And after they left, they went and they tried to get the receipt that they had left on the table. They couldn't get there fast enough. They cleared off the table. The bus staff cleaned off the table. So they left, and they came back an hour later, and they said, I'm here to get some documentation for taxes for my colleague who was here earlier, and we need a copy of the receipt. Didn't necessarily have to identify yourself as an investigator, because you're not trying to get what's called financial information. You're not getting bank accounts. You're not getting phone records. It's information that was public, and you're not misrepresenting, saying that you are that person. Again, you have to follow the laws in that instance. In that instance, the investigator knew exactly what the details were. And this is where licensing is important. When you become a licensed investigator, you have to pass an exam, so you know what the laws are. And when and where you have to identify yourself as a private investigator. This is a good example of where there's a difference between private investigating and the police. Many times a police officer would have to identify themselves as a police. If they're undercover in certain instances and they have a warrant, or they're doing certain type of things, they don't have to identify yourself. Private investigators usually do not. It's good practice to do so when appropriate. And of course, it's good practice to do so when it's required. In certain states will have requirements for that in certain instances. But in general, to answer your question, the answer is no. You don't have to say I am a private investigator in general, unless something triggers that. So we'll go a little longer. So we got a few more questions. One question is, need some help, been scammed, want to know how to get the money back. This is kind of what we talked about before. In getting money back from a scam, it's a 4-part process. And this is for the user with initials RR. The first step is identifying actually who took the money, right? This is kind of related to what we talked about a few minutes ago. If it's a website, who's behind the website? If you wired money, who's behind the account? If you talk to somebody on the phone, who's behind that phone number? Because you can't start getting assets back until you know who is the actual identity of the person or company that did the scam, right? A lot of times the company name or the website name is just a fake name. However, if somebody has received money, they actually have to go through a financial institution, whether it's a bank, PayPal, Stripe, some financial institution was the form of funds transferring to that company. You can't have a fake company with a bank account. There has to be a real person or a real company behind it. Even Stripe and PayPal requires that you identify yourself, and those can all be tracked. So step one is to find out who actually did the scam, who actually took the money, right? Not necessarily where it is now, because if it went to one person first and they transferred it to another account or shipped it overseas, that's a different story. Find out first who took the money. Once you've done that, then you're going to find out where their assets are. If it was XYZ trading company that you sent the money to, you want to find out what all the assets are of XYZ trading company: real estate, bank accounts, vehicles, trademarks, business, that kind of thing, to make sure that you know where all their assets are. Step 3 is to document the scam related to that company, related to those assets. If you have documentation of the scam connected to that company, connected to the assets, then you can do step 4, which is recovery of the funds, which is a seizure or writ of garnishment or some other legal process. And again, I'm going to refer to something that mentioned before in case there's some visitors that are here now. You need to get good legal advice in some cases. What we're talking about is investigative suggestions and advice, not legal advice. You can only get that from an attorney. Some of these steps may require legal advice. For example, to document a scam with a company, it may not be enough just to say to the bank, hey, I got scammed by this company, give me their money. There may need to be some legal sign off on it. For example, you might have to present the proof of the scam along with the name of the company and the bank account to a legal process, whether it's an attorney or a judge, to sign off on it to say, yeah, this is correct. Otherwise, anybody could just say, hey, that company is a scam, give me their money, right? Or somebody could say it about you. Think about that. If somebody just said, you're a scam, give me their money, you don't want somebody taking their word for it that you scam them to take your money. You want it to be a little more formal and documented. That's where these legal processes come in. The most common one we see for our clients is they get what's called a writ of garnishment. And you can carry that into a bank and the bank will give you their money. If you have a signed writ of garnishment that's documented, you carry that to a financial institution for that scammer, the bank has to give you their money and to recover your funds. There's a few steps you have to do before that. First, you have to identify actually who the scammer is and then connect the dots that way. So that's a good question. How do you get the money back? 4 steps: identify who it is, document the scam, identify the assets, and then connect those to the recovery. That's the way to do that. And again, there may be some legal advice you need from an attorney, but those are the steps. I think that should do it for this week. We're just over an hour. Appreciate all the questions and all the involvement. About every week, we'll have another live question and answer with an investigator, usually be myself, maybe somebody else in the office. Anytime during the week, if you have questions, you can email our help desk, help@activeintel.com, and we can put it in the queue. A lot of times we start out with questions that were from the week from one of our clients or from our email. And of course, if you get to the live chat when it's here, you can add something in. And the videos are all recorded on our channel. We have a lot of other videos that you can watch too about asset recovery, online scams, investigations, Ponzi schemes. You'll see all those on our website. Make sure to subscribe, because if you're subscribed to our channel, you get a notice when there's a live video and when we post a new video. And if you, I know you hate seeing it. When you watch videos, people tell you to like and subscribe. We only want you to do it if you actually liked it, because it gives us an opportunity to improve our video content, but it does help. The more you click on it, the more people are going to see it. So appreciate you taking the time to visit with us this week. Have a safe weekend, and we'll see you next week just before the holiday.